G'day folks, it's Rob Timmings here from ECT for Health. We're back with another episode of ECTopics, our podcast for nurses. So it's time to put down the stethoscope, grab yourself a Tim Tam and sit back and relax as we tackle yet another hopefully informative episode of ECTopics. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to my friend Anthony Wollaston. Anthony and I have been mates for the best part of 20 years, watching each other's kids grow up, and we go back as far as teaching the TNCC and other wonderful programs in the organisation of Queensland Health in the past. Anthony is a nurse of some 30 years of experience. He works currently as a nurse practitioner in a major metropolitan emergency department and has a very, very special interest in all things exercise, nutrition, health and sleep. And I really wanted to pick his brains, and so I thought it'd make a fantastic episode for our podcast of ECTopics. Anthony Wollaston, thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me, Rob, and the opportunity to talk about something that I really enjoy.
This is something you're really, really passionate about. It puts most people to sleep to talk about sleep. But fill us in. Why the interest in sleep?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, Rob. I certainly didn't discover sleep as a concept of any interest through the early, at least 2/3 of my career. It was just something that just happened. You did it every day and hoped for the best and got what you got. Probably, like most young nurses, when you're starting out, you'd sleep fine. And as I got older, getting adequate sleep became harder, especially with shift work. So probably just go back to the beginning a little bit. I started studying nutrition and environmental medicine, probably in the last 4 or 5 years. And sleep is a foundational tenet of health. Like, it's just one of the key pillars of health, and you just start to get a bigger appreciation for how important it is. And the fact that there is no health goal that you could possibly have where sleep isn't an important, integral component of achieving that goal. So I gained a better understanding of sleep more broadly and its impactfulness and importance in health generally. How that sort of tied in then with shift work was, I recall certainly when I was a shift worker, which I'm now I no longer have to do night duty, for which I'm grateful, but I would average 4, maybe 5 hours at best sleep during the day on night shifts. And by the time I'd done, that 3rd or 4th night, I was really struggling, absolutely struggling, felt like rubbish. And I recall how hard it was to function and feel safe and reasonable at that time. And I knew nothing about what I knew now.
Yeah.
And so then now that I'm still working in a large metro ED, I'm still working with a huge group of shift workers daily. And I thought about, for my colleagues, I recall how lousy I felt on nights and how poor my sleep was. And knowing how important it is to health, I sort of started delving into, how could you improve the life of a shift worker and the sleep they got? And it was just thinking about that question. One day I stumbled upon an article that was published in the journal Chest, and they'd put together a bit of an evidence-based summary about shift work and sleep and ideas around how where the science was saying you might be able to improve sleep. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Maybe we could actually, if we could bring this to the table and educate our staff, maybe we could get them more sleep. And that was kind of just where the ideas sort of generated from and sort of led me down that path.
So, Anthony, it's a catchphrase at the moment. We're all in this together. Shift workers, irrespective of whether they work in the health industry like you and I do, or whether they work in other theatres of practice, other industry, shift work has always come with it almost that rite of passage that you're going to be tired, that you're going to have poor sleep. Don't we just suck it up and accept it? I mean, are there really problems with not getting
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think I grew up with the same philosophy you did. We just sucked it up. You got what you got, and then you persevered and hope for the best. And
I'm playing the devil's advocate.
I recall going to night duty, literally with a can of V in my hand and chili chips, and other assorted stimulants, doing anything I did, could desperately to try and get through. So I have vivid recollections of feeling lousy like that. The thing that I think is so important is that we know that it's so detrimental with poor sleep in the shift worker. So the thing that we can say from the evidence is that it clearly sabotages your quality of life, it increases your risk of chronic disease, you're more at risk of work-related injury, contributes to burnout and jeopardises the patient's safety. So when you put that all together, it's massive. The issue of sleep and the shift worker is huge. And the other thing that I think becomes important to me is we know two things about, that potential health harm. There's an association between shift work and increased breast cancer risk for women. And we know that there's now shift work is considered a probable carcinogen. Okay, so I think we need to,
That's a big call.
Absolutely, and that's been documented now by some international groups, and I think that's a really important thing that we need to now consider. It's shift work. I guess I understand that it's a necessary part of our work. But we also need to now be really mindful of its potential adverse health effects for our staff, and we really need to concentrate on how we actually manage that.
So it sounds like there is a recognition in the literature around disorder, around lack of sleep. It's been coined the shift worker sleep disorder. What can you tell us about this?
So there's a lot of studies now in shift workers, various professional groups, and it's a recognised sleep disorder now, shift work sleep disorder. It has various characteristics about how they determine whether you meet that specific qualification. But what is useful to know is that the suggestion from the literature is that in shift work sleep disorder is around about 25% of the shift work population or group that are undertaking shift work.
That's really prevalent.
So from my point of view, I would have thought that has been an underestimate. Like, tell me a nurse who's a shift worker who doesn't feel tired and doesn't feel like it's affecting their life. Yeah. I would have thought, anecdotally, to me, 25% seems too low, but yeah. Anyway, that's certainly documented in the literature across model studies.
I guess given that it's been classified as a disorder, it would be there'd be an expectation that all criteria have to be met to be able to achieve a diagnosis, and probably a lot of it flies under the radar.
Yes, yeah, I think so.
Possibly because of archaic attitudes about sleep and shift work. That's my lot in life.
Yes, yeah. I think underreporting and people just persevering and just making do probably is an adequate, like a good reflection of what you're saying.
So it's starting to get a little bit personal now. Obstructive sleep apnea and sleep. For most nurses and for most clinicians that will listen to the podcast, there is a recognition that certainly we understand that somebody who snores or somebody with obstructive sleep apnea or central sleep apnea for that matter have disrupted sleep, and that has longer term health implications like heart failure and so on and so forth. What can you tell us about obstructive sleep apnea?
I think the really important thing for people to realise is that OSA is surprisingly common. So the suggestion is that 1 in 10 Australians are dealing with OSA or obstructive sleep apnea.
10%.
That's right, 1 in 10. And a good percentage of those are undiagnosed and not managed. Now, the really important part about that is that if you have obstructive sleep apnea, that's profoundly impacting sleep quality. you have to sort that out and you have to get it managed. Otherwise, all the twiddling around the edges isn't going to really, solve the major problem. The other thing I think is really important about it is that if you sleep with someone who has obstructive sleep apnea, that's not being managed. The evidence would say that you've got at least a 50% sleep disruption yourself, and that's massively sabotaging your sleep quality. So if you sleep with someone who has OSA, they need to manage it, or if they've got OSA, they need to manage it. And that's a really important thing for people to recognise and get sorted out early, on that road to trying to preserve sleep quality.
Sure. So management of sleep apnea is step one would be to see your GP.
See your GP. It's very easy to get a sleep study now in your own home. You turn up, get strapped onto a device, they send you home, you have your night's sleep in your own bed, you turn the machine to them, give them the machine back the next morning. They print out the stuff. It's a bit like having a Holter monitor, really.
Yeah.
They send it to the sleep specialist. They read the study. They give you the report back to your GP. It's just so much better these days.
Sure. I guess people fear having to be on a CPAP machine for the rest of their days.
I certainly understand that point, but people just have to recognise that it's a major impact on sleep quality. And if you want to be sleeping better, you've got to manage it.
Yep. Not good for the brain, sleep deprivation.
No, and I think this is the thing for people to really recognise is that what does sleep do for the brain? We now know through very clever imaging studies, through MRI scans, that the brain has its own lymphatic system called the glymphatic system.
Say that again, the
glymphatic system. Yeah. Now,
it sounds like you're just making this stuff up.
Now, the glymphatic system, the fascinating part about the glymphatic system is that neural tissue has to physically move itself around to open up the glymphatic channels, and then the body actually pulses CSF fluid through the brain as that cleaning mechanism, and this cleaning mechanism predominantly happens overnight. So this is the point.
Overnight, if you're not, while you're asleep, because that can differ depending on...
while you're asleep.
While you're asleep.
Yeah, good, well said. While you're asleep, that mechanism is happening and is at play. So the point is that if you're not sleeping well and you're not getting enough sleep, you're not cleaning. The cleaning isn't happening for the brain.
So we're talking about things like the tau proteins and
the beta amyloid plaques, the tau tangles, these metabolic waste products build up in the brain. And we know from some of the early studies now that so they took a group of healthy volunteers. They scanned their brain, very specifically looking for the beta amyloid plaque level in their brain. Then they deprived them of one night of adequate sleep. They went and scanned their brains again, and they were able to show a significant elevation in beta amyloid plaque burden through one night of sleep deprivation. So it's a great proof of the knowledge that we have now around that cleaning mechanism for the brain, and that inadequate sleep increases the risk of neurodegenerative disease.
I was just going to say, where does that fit in with Alzheimer's and other dementias?
That's right. So we know that from large epidemiological studies that poor sleep, somewhere under the 6-7 hour mark, chronically over longer periods of time, significantly increases dementia risk in the order of something like 30% or something along those lines. So it does contribute. It does contribute to your risk of neurodegenerative disease. And the other thing that I think is important for people to know is that Alzheimer's dementia is now the leading cause of death for women in Australia.
It trumps cardiovascular disease?
Correct, yeah. So for me, again, it's really important that the majority of my colleagues are women. This is now the leading cause of death. And we know that, we're having significant sleep issues as part of our occupational choice, and that it increases the breast cancer risk. So for me, the issue becomes really important that if I'm caring for my colleagues, this becomes a really big issue and a really important one.
I'm a little bit rattled by that. So we're actually talking about mortality. We're not just talking about sleep deprivation being an inconvenience. We're actually talking about raw mortality data here.
Yeah, that's right. We're really talking about that significant increased morbidity and mortality associated with that loss of sleep quality and sleep duration over a long period of time associated with your work.
It astounds me that big organisations that employ shift workers aren't looking more and more into this.
I'm fascinated equally, Rob, that this is something that we just accept as a consequence of our profession, and that it is clearly undermanaged as a risk factor for the health and well-being of our staff. I think this is absolutely critical for people to manage if they want to, sustain a long-term, be a health professional for a long period of time in our industry.
So, I've just got so many questions, Anthony. So with regards to poor sleep giving rise to being a stressor, and we've certainly got mortality data on that, and a stressor being a stimulus for a release of cortisol or an increase in cortisol, which becomes an immune suppressant. What do we know about sleep deprivation or sleep health, or the lack thereof, and immunity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. There's really good studies now that show, there's plenty of evidence to say now that if I deprive you of sleep and then I challenge your body and expose it to a rhinovirus, you're much more likely to develop that illness as a consequence. So we know that there is a degree of immune system depression associated with poor sleep. Okay, and then if you challenge people and expose them to infections, that they have an increased risk of developing that infection. The second part of the puzzle, which I think is fascinating in that story equally, is we know that if we give you a vaccination, which is deliberately challenging, and asking for an immune response from the body, if you are sleep deprived, you will mount a poorer immunological response to that vaccination. And I think that's, and I think that and everybody intuitively knows that is that when what happens when you run down, you get a cold.
You get a cold, yeah.
And so everybody intuitively understands that, and I think the point for that is the fact. Please, if you're getting a vaccination in the future, which is really hot topic right now,
isn't it?
Don't do it during your nights. Make sure it occurs at a time when you are well rested and not during your night shifts. And
so
no one
to the clinic as you're knocking off that night.
Absolutely not. And equally is the same thing as we, as in the health system, shouldn't be asking any of our night duty staff as they're walking out at the door if they'd like their flu vax jab.
Yes.
Please don't do that either.
Not that ever happens in busy hospitals. Okay, so immunity and sleep. Wow. Ticking so many boxes here, Anthony. What about nutrition? This is a bit of a bugbear for me. How can I give myself a nutritional edge?
It's a great question, and I'm not trying to...
Because I'm thinking if I eat or drink something that makes me sleepy or drowsy, the whole... have half a glass of warm milk before you go to bed sort of thing, or avoid, equally, the question around avoiding a stimulant or maybe taking a depressant like a sneaky drink before you go to sleep. Where does the whole what we put into our body thing come into play?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's really, and I'm not suggesting nutrition is the silver bullet that's going to cure all sleep ills and you're going to become a fabulous sleeper, but there is evidence to support that doing some nutritional things can help improve sleep. Now there is some data, and there's not masses of data out there, but from what I can glean, we know that from some single nutrient studies and some multi-nutrient studies that certain nutritional deficits will be in fact impactful on sleep quality. Some of this comes down to understanding how melatonin is produced in the body, and that it's actually it's quite a long chemical cascade of turning one substance into the next substance into the next substance, and using multiple cofactors associated with those conversions.
So before we go any further, melatonin, just so that everybody's on the same page listening to the podcast, is the hormone produced or converted in the pineal gland?
That's right. So melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, in the brain, as the internal sleep cue to the body that we are coming into sleep, and that's in response to lowering light levels as you come into the evening. Now, that melatonin, though, requires an enormous amount of work from the body. It's starting with the digestion of proteins in the body, coming into the body, being converted into other substrates that become serotonin, and then subsequently that serotonin becomes the platform for being converted into your melatonin. And in those pathways, there are an enormous amount of cofactors that are required for that melatonin production. And to give you a bit of a sense,
so serotonin today is your melatonin tonight.
That's right. So there's a nice little adage which says the path to a good night's sleep starts in the morning. So in response to bright light, and in the morning, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in your brain
the
suprachiasmatic nucleus starts producing serotonin, and that's the feel-good, wake-up and be happy hormone that you love.
It's the one we're stimulating or regulating when we use anti-anxiety and antidepressants.
That's right. And bright light is part of what the stimulating mechanism that's producing that response in the morning, that wakefulness, wake up and get into the day response. And that, that is also becoming the substrate for tonight's melatonin production. So you can see the tie-in.
Yeah. So
just to go on to one other point, to give people a little bit of an idea when I'm talking about the cofactors and this chemical pathway, there was a nice study of geriatric patients who they gave magnesium to every night for it was 8 or 12 weeks, and they studied their sleep quality and duration, but they also measured their melatonin levels.
Yes.
And what they found that with regular supplementation of magnesium each night, they found that the actual amount of melatonin over the course of the study they produced increased. Now that makes good physiological sense because you actually need magnesium as a cofactor for melatonin production.
Sure.
So you can sort of
on the pizza, so to speak.
An ingredient on pizza. So you can sort of see where there's some evidence for magnesium supplementation as a nutrient that can help you with your sleep, and that study sort of points to that fact that there was an elevation in melatonin response in that group, and they got more sleep.
I don't know how related it is, but many would attest to the fact that magnesium is associated with relaxation. We certainly use it to relax smooth muscles in asthma. We use it as an adjunct in advanced life support with certain forms of ventricular tachycardia. The magnesium bath, having a lovely
Epsom salts bath.
We associate it with that sort of relaxation. So it's not too far to disconnect. It's not too difficult to connect magnesium and sleep being an important thing. Where's our sources of magnesium? Other than supplements?
Yes, that's right. So I think magnesium's pretty predominant, across a lot of food sources in the diet. Interestingly enough, for me as a person who loves dark chocolate, it's very high in magnesium.
Okay.
Lots of the nuts.
Nuts come to mind for mag and zinc.
Yep. So I think there's, I can't remember a lot more of the other ones off the top of my head. I always remember chocolate just because I like it.
Chocolate and nuts.
Hang on a second. That's right. So nuts, avocado, banana, seeds, spinach, lots of those are
leafy greens. Yeah,
leafy greens. Yeah,
your leafy greens. Everywhere you're going to find sort of folic acid and B groups and zinc. So there's some. So that's a cofactor. What other sort of micronutrients or?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple that I really like to key in on. One is zinc. So there is some experimental data out there in shift working nurses that zinc supplementation increased overall sleep duration. Zinc is an important cofactor in the production pathway for melatonin. And the other thing that I think is important for zinc is that it's an important component of the immune system. Yes, it's also been shown that deficiency is associated with increased mood disorders and particularly depression. So for me, zinc is a really just a very crucial element for us to consider being replete in or having enough in the system. It's very easy to be deficient or suboptimal, and it's a key player in the immune system, especially at the tissue level of tissue barrier function level in the immune system. And I think in the current climate, it's really important for us to consider that. There's certainly evidence to show that zinc deficiency is associated with increased morbidity, mortality risk with COVID. And it makes pretty good sense given how zinc works in the immune system. So, there's just another really good reason, I think, to have zinc, really on the top of the menu for being, looked after and making sure you've got enough of it in the system.
Again, we're looking at leafy greens and zinc, leafy greens and nuts.
Yep.
Okay, folks, so that's where we're going to wrap up this episode. It was an amazing talk, and it went for about an hour and 20 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to chop this podcast up into 3 distinct sections. I know I said at the very beginning of the podcast it was only going to be 2, but we're going to chop it up into 3 sections. This is part 1 that you've just listened to. Tune in next week and keep an eye on our podcast channel for when we post up episode 2 and then again edit up episode number 3. My name is Rob Timmings. You've been listening to ECTopics, a podcast for nurses.